Topic at that for this week.
Hi, my name is Peyton. I'm determined to prove a villain, so Richard III in Shakespeare. So Richard III was written by William Shakespeare and is arguably one of his best-known works. Yet the real Richard III is hidden behind years of lies and personal attacks. So from his downfall, the foundation was laid by King Henry VII and his accomplice John Morton. A common saying is that victors write the history, and that saying applies the most to Richard III. So Richard III's myth was started by Henry Tudor, aka Henry VII, but his legend was created by William Shakespeare. Single-handedly, Shakespeare combined all sources to put together a master plan of Richard's alleged crimes. Quote, "I am determined to prove a villain," end quote, is a line from the show that illustrates Shakespeare's goal. Richard was made a legend by a man who wanted to write a fantastic piece of drama. The list of crimes commonly attributed to Richard come from the Shakespearean play, yet what of historical facts? It is easy to recite Shakespearean lines, and much harder to recite factual history. And too many times people take Shakespeare's plays as the truth. So I'm just going to go through the play and the chronological history and talk about each. So appearance according to Shakespeare. So one of the most well-known characteristics of Richard is of his appearance. In the play's opening speech, Richard tells the audience that he was born, quote, deformed and unfinished, end quote. Other references to Richard include, quote, lump of foul deformity, elvish, marked, abortive, rooting hog, and poisonous sponge-backed toad, end quote. While Shakespeare wasn't the first to mark Richard as deformed, he certainly was the one who made Richard the deformed monster history. So while there's not a plethora of information on Richard's appearance, there's enough to conclude that he was not deformed. In actuality, his right shoulder was slightly higher than his left. He was also known to be a good fighter, and the Croyland Chronicle at the time makes no mention of an abnormal appearance. Furthermore, Roos created a descriptive history known as the Rorwick Roll, and he made two of them. The first one, the one in English, was not in his hands when Richard died, and this one depicted Richard normally. The second roll, however, was still in Roos's possession when Henry Tudor came to power, and this scroll is drastically altered. So next we talk about George, Duke of Clarence. This is Richard's brother. In Richard III, Richard is portrayed as having a great hand in eliminating his brother George in order to get closer to the throne. And George is shown as a victim, passionate and loyal to his brothers, and he's really regretful for past actions. The real Duke of Clarence, however, was before the birth of King Edward's son in 1470, his heir. So at this time, King Edward gave Clarence a dukedom, made him Knight of the Garter, made him Lieutenant of Ireland, and gave him several manors. Yet Clarence was never satisfied because he joined with Richard Neville, otherwise known as Warwick or the Kingmaker, to remove King Edward, and this resulted in a brief exile for him for some years. So after this episode, there was a lot of tension between Clarence and King Edward, and this boiled over into Clarence accusing Ancaret Tiro of having poisoned his wife. So she was found guilty and hanged in a speedy trial. Afterwards, the jury stated that they had been forced to make a guilty verdict. And so here's where Clarence violated the laws of England for the last time. So unlike the Shakespearean tale, there is really nothing to connect Richard to Clarence's death. In fact, Mancini, an Italian historian, wrote that Richard, quote, had been so overcome with grief for his brother that he could not dissimulate so well, that he was overheard to have said that he would one day avenge his brother's death. So there's really simply no proof to connect Richard to his brother's death, and therefore it's correct to assume that this crime was added to Richard's list to blacken his name even further. So this leads you to the next plot point in the play, and that's the deaths of King Henry VI and his son Edward of Lancaster. So two other crimes commonly attributed to Richard in Shakespeare's Richard III are the deaths of Henry VI and Edward of Lancaster. So in the play, Richard says that he killed the two because of the beauty of Anne Neville. Quote, "Nay, do not pause, for I did not kill King Henry, but 'twas thy beauty that provoked me. Nay, now dispatch, 'twas I that stabbed young Edward, but that 'twas thy heavenly face that set me on." So it was not until after Richard's death that these crimes were laid at his feet. And it's important to note that there are not any contemporary accusations or accounts implicating Richard in either of these deaths. And as for Edward of Lancaster, as Paul Murray Kendall states in his book Richard III, quote, "No less than 7 contemporary sources offer unanimous testimony that Prince Edward of Lancaster was slain on the field, i.e. in pursuit." And as for King Henry VI, it's important to note that he died under King Edward IV's protection. And at that time, Richard was Constable of England. So it would have been his responsibility to carry out any orders issued by the king. So it would not have been on Richard's authority to act without his king's permission either. So Richard didn't kill Henry VI because he wasn't ordered to do so, or he did because he was ordered to kill him. So the real drama of Richard's life is about to begin with the death of his brother Edward. Richard, at the time of Edward's death, was Lord of the North, and he was very successful. Richard's loyalty had not once been doubted. Moreover, Richard's motto translates to loyalty binds me, and it speaks to his love for his family. So there's no reason why King Edward would have ever doubted his brother or his loyalty, hence why they made him Lord Protector of the realm. So on April 9th, 1483, King Edward dies, and the Woodvilles, which is his wife's family, were all located in London and all in positions of power. So Edward's death, the Woodville family took control and action almost immediately against Richard. So it all boils down to when Richard went to get the young king, Edward V. The Rivers family had sent the young king forward and not letting him meet his uncle and guardian. And a lot of historians say that this is the point where Richard became concerned. So whether it be that when Hastings wrote a letter of warning to Richard or that the young king was not there to greet his uncle, Richard acted like one who was in a time of crisis. So the next day, on April 30th, Richard arrested Rivers Gray and Sir Thomas Vaughan, all of the Woodville faction. And this is seen to some today as an effective strategic move to counter a Woodville coup. So Richard came to London with the young king on May 4th, and once in London, Richard wasted no time in his duties. His position as Lord Protector was ratified by the council, and his plans for Edward's coronation were being set in place for June 22nd. So Lord William Hastings' death. In the Shakespearean version, Richard kills Hastings because he's on the way to the throne, and Richard wants to take power. And in the historical version, Hastings turns on Richard and conspires against him. And I argue that this is linked to the pre-contract. So this pre-contract is linked to the Revelation. And Robert Stillington was Bishop of Bath and of Wells, and he was a long-time serving Chancellor of Edward IV. And so his revelation changes everything. This revelation claimed that King Edward IV had married before Elizabeth Woodville to a woman named Eleanor Butler. And this contract between the two had been done at a ceremony attended and officiated by Stillington himself. Therefore, the contract was fully binding. So if this previous contract was binding, then Edward and Elizabeth's marriage was bigamous, and their children illegitimate. So the young King Edward V was not the lawful king of England. I argue that Hastings joined Morton in conspiring against Richard fully once he heard of this pre-contract. This could have been the very move that pushed Hastings away from Richard. Hastings had never been close with Richard, and in fact, they were total opposites. So now that Hastings saw that their goals did not line up, and in fact, Richard may have had a new one, he decided to break away. So this leads to on June 13th, Richard accuses Morton, Hastings, Rotherham, and Stanley of treason, resulting with Hastings' death. And so this all boils down to, as June 25th, the council reviews Stillington's claims and finds in favor of Richard, and they ask for Richard to be crowned. And then on June 26th, Richard is asked to be king publicly, and he accepts. This leads back to the play's plot, and this is going into Buckingham's rebellion. So Buckingham in the play rises up against Richard because he knows Richard had the princes murdered. Shakespeare is using the most common and Tudor-friendly theory as to why Buckingham revolted, yet as with the rest of the play, this adaptation might be false. So the real Buckingham was married to the sister of Elizabeth Woodville, but he also had been a loyal Richard supporter throughout the years. So no one has really been able to fully explain his change of allegiance. The facts are that he was married to a Woodville, and it's important to note that he kept John Morton as a prisoner, and Buckingham eventually revolted with Morton, which hurt and infuriated Richard. All in all, the rebellion was a complete failure, and it cost him his life. So through Buckingham's rebellion, the topic of the princes arrives in real history and in the Shakespearean play. In the play, Richard has James Tyrrell kill his nephews in the Tower so he can take the throne. There are numerous problems with this version, though. The first one being that Richard did not need to kill the princes. Why would he need to murder his nephews if he had the right to the throne through the council ratifying him? And it was legally passed by Parliament. So the princes were declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. Why would he need to murder them? So in terms of this, there are three alternate versions, and the main three is that the next person historians turn to is Buckingham himself. So Buckingham could have killed the princes for Richard without his permission. He was a descendant of Thomas of Woodstock and of John of Gaunt, meaning that he was the only living Plantagenet who could possibly challenge Richard's reign. As the Constable of England at the time, he did have access to the princes, yet most historians are in agreement that Buckingham would not have dared act without Richard, just like Richard would not have acted without Edward IV with King Henry VI. So the next person to fall under suspicion is Henry Tudor, aka Henry VII. So one would think that Henry would have claimed the boys dead when he took the power, and so would have blackened Richard's name, but he didn't. Henry initially never took legal steps to find out who murdered the boys. It wasn't until 17 years later and 2 threats to the throne that Henry Tudor finally blamed someone. So in 1502, James Tyrrell, a man who navigated Richard and part of Henry's reign, was arrested and beheaded for associating with the Earl of Suffolk, a Yorkist pretender. But it wasn't until after Tyrell was executed that he was declared that he had somehow confessed to murdering the princes under Richard's orders. Another version is that one of them or both of them escaped, and while there's loose theories to prevent it, some people look to Perkin Warbeck as the prince that escaped from the town. So the mystery continued as in 1674, workmen found a set of bones in the south side of the tower under the foundations of the staircase. These bones were said to have been thrown in a pile where they remained for some time until the news of their discovery was heard by Charles II. So the bones were collected and said to have been the supposed bones of the two princes. In 1933, they were exhumed and examined by Professor Wright, and there was really inconclusive evidence. It was done in the Abbey and not in a proper lab, and the tests that can be done today to prove DNA were not invented back then. But it was published anyways that these were the boys' bones, and he said that he found parts of two children's skeletons around the ages of 12 and 10 and a half, but the sex was unknown. So looking at the report today, there are obvious holes. First off, the bones could be female. Second, there is nothing to identify them as a prince's bones. They could just have been any other bones from children. There are numerous types of bones scattered throughout the tower that were found, one instance being that they were apes' bones beforehand. So there's really no inconclusive evidence. Going back to the plot of the play storyline, Richard kills his wife, Queen Anne, in order to go after his niece, Elizabeth. It is likely that Queen Anne died from tuberculosis, a disease that killed her sister as well. So Richard's grief at her death has been recorded, and there was no talk of poison or foul play at the time, and these accounts of poison appear later with the Tudor Chronicles. So, finishing up the play, Shakespeare first throws in a dream sequence where all of those who are Richard's victims come to haunt him as ghosts. In this sequence, each victim says one last statement about how they died or how they have cursed the vile Richard. And then in the next scene, Richard goes into battle and loses because he's betrayed. So this sequence has set up a play as like a full circle plot. Richard's victims have come back to see his downfall. Richmond, or Henry Tudor in the play, is shown as a hero and a savior to no one's surprise. In his speech to rile the men in Act 5, Scene 3, Richmond portrays Richard as a myth we know today, the man who is a bloody tyrant. Furthermore, after slaying Richard in battle, Richmond gives the play's closing speech by pardoning the soldiers that were fighting for Richard. However, the real Henry Tudor did not pardon the men. In fact, Henry Tudor did quite the opposite. Instead of pardoning men who fought for Richard III, the anointed king at the time, Henry Tudor crowned himself King Henry VII and dated his reign starting the day before the Battle of Bosworth. So for the men fighting for Richard were a reign of treason. So overall, the real Richard III should have won the battle. While the numbers aren't exact, it's estimated that Henry Tudor brought about 5,000 men and Richard brought about 9,000 men. Richard had military experience, he had the army, and he had a record for glory. So in the Battle of Bosworth Field, written by a Northerner about a decade after the battle, 90 noblemen and gentry are listed to have fought on his side. In fact, most of the nobility obeyed Richard's summons to arms, so he was not lacking general support from the public, yet he failed to secure the most important people of all, and those are his generals. So of the four leading generals, the Duke of Norfolk was slayed, Lord Stanley and his brother William switched sides to Henry Tudor, and the Earl of Northumberland did not fight at all. So all had personal motivations to gain by switching to Henry Tudor's side. Since Richard had failed to secure the loyalty, he dared to strike with a last-minute plan that ultimately cost him life. Richard's charge on Henry Tudor has been portrayed as a suicide attempt, but it was probably the last resort of a man who believed he could actually win. Unfortunately, he was wrong. So the real Richard III never stood a chance against Shakespeare's creative genius. And one has to understand that Shakespeare was a writer and an entertainer. He was probably not concerned with straight facts, but more of what would make a good story. It's also important to note that when he was writing and who he was writing for, Shakespeare wrote Richard III around the year 1597, a time of uncertainty and unrest, also during the time of the Elizabethan period. So Shakespeare wrote in order to make a living and not to get in trouble, so he wrote to please his Elizabethan audience. So all in all, while the history of Richard III is ultimately confusing and a mystery, there is still enough evidence to frame an argument in defense of Richard. It's highly unfair and inaccurate to perpetrate a myth that Shakespeare created, considering Richard ascended the throne in a time of crisis, not to mention he did it legally. Furthermore, it's important as historians to question sources and their bias. It's easy to see that most sources written about Richard have a strong Tudor bias. And it's even easier to establish that Shakespeare wrote not to capture history, but to capture a morality tale that would entice an audience. So Shakespeare took a foundation that was already biased and turned it into a masterpiece. Shakespeare sealed Richard's fate. And it's because of Richard III that most people know of the hunchbacked, child-murdering king more than they know of a man who actually passed laws for the poor and the needy. So overall, Shakespeare made the worst out of Richard, but Richard III brought the best out of Shakespeare. Thank you.